and together they have 3 children. The title of his talk today is The U.S. Supreme Court's 2022 Dobbs Decision and the History of the Pro-Life Movement. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Stuart.
Thank you. There's no such thing as a lost cause because there's no such thing as a gained cause. Those are the words of the great English poet T.S. Eliot. He meant them as both an encouragement and a warning. An encouragement because there's always hope. A warning because victory is still met with opposition. There's no such thing as a lost cause because there's no such thing as a gained cause. Father James McHugh was the first director of the National Right to Life Committee, founded by the U.S. Catholic bishops. He's known as the father of the pro-life movement. He said this after the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, quote, "It may take 50 years, but I am confident it will happen. Roe," he said, "will be reversed." And now it has been. 49 years, 5 months, and 2 days later. The case that did it is called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, decided by the U.S. Supreme Court on June 24th, 2022. Dobbs is a major victory for the pro-life cause. It is a testimony to the countless efforts of pro-life heroes. At the same time, it inaugurates a new phase of the pro-life movement and a certain ambiguity in the arithmetic of lost and gained causes. The U.S. Supreme Court decided in Roe v. Wade that the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, quote, protects against state action the right to privacy, including a woman's unqualified right to terminate her pregnancy. The 1992 Supreme Court case Planned Parenthood versus Casey discarded much of Roe's reasoning, but defended the essential holding of Roe on the existence of a right to abortion as part of the liberty defended by the 14th Amendment. The relevant part of the 1868 14th Amendment reads like this: "No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." That's it. That was the constitutional basis for the right to abortion. The Dobbs decision denied the validity of this pro-abortion constitutional interpretation, saying the idea of liberty does not mean simply whatever we want it to mean. Abortion was considered a crime by many state governments at the time of the 14th Amendment, not a liberty. Claims to rights not specifically mentioned in the Constitution need to have a deep history in our country's story to be legitimate. They must accord with what the court called ordered liberty, respecting limits and setting boundaries between competing interests. And such rights claims must pass through the political process, reaching from state and federal governments all the way up to constitutional amendment. No constitutional amendment recognizing a right to abortion ever happened. Roe subverted that process. Therefore, the court in Dobbs made this judgment, quote, "The Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. Roe and Casey must be overruled, and the authority to regulate abortion must be returned to the people and their elected representatives." This is an astonishing turn of events. Dobbs is significant not because it ends abortion. It does not. But because it removes abortion at the federal judiciary level from the language of rights. Rights language has given immense power to the abortion lobby ever since the 1970s. which is why pro-choice leaders, even outside the U.S., are concerned about the ripple effects of the Dobbs decision around the world. So how did we get to this place? How did the history of abortion and the history of the pro-life movement help us understand the present moment? Looking to the past to see how the pro-life movement fits into the wider context of American moral reform reveals insights into the challenges and opportunities facing our new era of what I call pro-life reconstruction. This is both a political and a cultural reconstruction that reimagines traditional American ideas of equality, liberty, and rights, and even what it means to be American. So my first section is entitled Controversy over the History of Abortion, because the struggle over abortion has much to do with a struggle over the history of abortion, because history is important for law. Was abortion or was abortion not an accepted liberty in the centuries before Roe? This is a key question, and the answer is hotly contested. Professor of law Joseph W. Della Penna researched it deeply in his 1,100-page book, Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History, published in 2006. It was cited repeatedly by Justice Samuel Alito in his majority opinion in Dobbs. Della Penna notes that both pro-life and pro-abortion historians have distorted the status of abortion in history. Pro-life narratives have assumed abortion was a common practice in the past, which is not true, because it was way too dangerous. More common was infanticide. So pro-life narratives have assumed abortion was a common practice in the past, untrue. That it was normally considered a serious crime, which is true. And that therefore it was vigorously prosecuted, which is untrue, because by its nature it was a crime difficult to prosecute. Okay, so that's the pro-life narrative, sometimes. The current orthodoxy about abortion in American history, however, that it was an accepted liberty, has been created by pro-abortion historians whose work, Della Penna showed, exhibits far greater distortions than the anti-abortion interpretation. For example, the Roe v. Wade decision relied on the historical work of pro-abortion law professor Cyril Means, Jr. He produced two seriously flawed articles in 1968 and 1971 without revealing his work was funded by the abortion movement itself. Means propounded two myths that Roe later relied on in its decision: that abortion was not criminal in England and America before the 19th century, untrue, and that abortion was criminalized during the 19th century solely to protect the life or health of mothers, which is also untrue. Reading present agendas back into the past, this law professor's historical narrative seemed to suggest abortion was not a crime, but a liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. Justice Harry Blackmun, who wrote the majority opinion in Roe, relied on Means's flawed history in his decision. Pro-abortion advocates still accept these views today without question. In reality, Della Penna argued, Anglo-American law has always treated abortion as a serious crime, and abortion was always illegal throughout all or most stages of pregnancy until reforms started on both sides of the Atlantic in 1967. Before then, the law sought to protect fetal life, protect the mother's life and health, and protect women from abortion coercion. So, how did abortion move from crime to medicine in the 20th century? Part 2. I began this speech with T.S. Eliot's words, "There is no such thing as a lost cause because there is no such thing as a gained cause." He wrote them in a 1927 essay about how utilitarianism recurs in each generation in new forms. This philosophy held that individuals could be sacrificed for the sake of public health or social betterment. Some physicians and then lawyers began pushing for abortion legalization during the Great Depression of the 1930s on utilitarian grounds, as many women sought illegal abortions to avoid having extra mouths to feed. Abortion was not yet thought of as a right. Catholics, and it was mainly Catholics at this point, successfully argued against legalizing abortion and contraception, which they saw as a closely related issue, on the basis of natural law. In other words, that it is the nature of human sexuality to result in pregnancy and birth, and so to artificially and intentionally thwart it is wrong. That was the basis of the argument at that time. Pressure mounted during the 1960s, however, as women's social roles began to change. In addition, new intrusion abortion procedures made abortion safer for women. The fear of birth defects generated by the German measles epidemic of 1963 to 65 played a role in swinging public attitudes away from the view of abortion as a crime to the view of abortion as a sometimes needed medical procedure. This is when the father of the abortion movement, Larry Lader, entered the scene. He was a journalist and an activist who believed ideas rule the world. An early Marxist supporter, he identified the Catholic hierarchy as enemy number one. It was while working on a biography of birth control activist Margaret Sanger during the 1950s in the New York Public Library that Larry Lader met Betty Friedan, the future feminist leader who was also working at the library on her book, The Feminine Mystique of 1963. Now, many early feminists did not support abortion, and even Friedan never mentioned it in her book. She supported women becoming mothers. The women's movement and the abortion movement were largely distinct movements at this time with different goals. Larry Lader wanted to change that. Though his birth control hero Sanger did not support abortion, he became obsessed with abortion. His 1966 book on abortion, influenced by pro-abortion law professor Cyril Means, who we mentioned earlier, served up masterful propaganda about how abortion would eliminate unwanted children and therefore ensure every child's becoming a wanted child. Later concluded his book this way, quote, "The ultimate freedom remains the right of every woman to legalized abortion." So Larry Lader dreamed of the ultimate coup: convince the women's rights movement to embrace abortion as part of its agenda. His efforts finally worked. 1 year after his abortion book appeared, the new president of the National Organization for Women, now Betty Friedan, controversially pushed through a vote on November 18th, 1967. That's the key date. November 18th, 1967, linking abortion to now. According to one journalist present at this time, Friedan did it by keeping the resolution secret until it was voted on suddenly at the end of the meeting. Larry Lader's and Friedan's hijack of the women's movement was a brilliant win for abortion advocates because it framed the abortion issue in terms of controlling one's own body and personal rights. Larry Lader, Betty Friedan, and abortionist Bernard Nathanson. He later stopped doing abortions and converted to Catholicism. But Larry Lader, Betty Friedan, and Bernard Nathanson founded the National Association for Repeal of Abortion Laws, NARAL, in 1969. Eventually, Justice Harry Blackmun relied heavily on Lader's abortion book in Roe, justifying Lader's title as the father of the abortion movement. Part 3 is on Roe v. Wade and the pro-choice regime. Now, Roe fell like a bombshell on the pro-life movement in 1973. It forced 46 states to rewrite their laws and gave a solid victory to the abortion rights cause. The effects could be seen in North Dakota, for example. On January 11th, 1973, members of the North Dakota Right to Life Association convened in Bismarck for their first annual meeting, just days before the Roe decision. They were optimistic for the future because they had just won a major referendum victory in November of 1972 Get this, right? 77% to 23%, defeating a proposal to extend abortion in North Dakota. This left the old law on the books, banning abortion except to save the life of the mother. The North Dakota Right to Life meeting in January, in fact, sought to move forward on the next stage of the pro-life agenda, which included health insurance for unwed mothers, subsidized adoption, and daycare centers. These North Dakotans wanted to not only keep abortion illegal, they wanted to create a compassionate society in which abortion would seem unnecessary and unthinkable. 11 days after the Bismarck meeting, the Roe decision came as a major setback. North Dakota defied the Supreme Court for as long as she could by refusing to pass an abortion law. Then, in 1974, a district court struck down North Dakota's abortion restriction, but even then, North Dakota hospitals refused to perform the procedure. So, what do people do when the highest court in the land pronounces something constitutional that they consider gravely immoral? Several months after the Roe decision, 30,000 pro-life supporters gathered in St. Louis. They listened to a speech by Mildred Jefferson, the most prominent African American in the pro-life movement at the time. She was also the first black woman to graduate from Harvard Medical School. Jefferson denounced Roe v. Wade at that gathering in St. Louis with these words, quote, "We are determined that the Supreme Court decision on abortion shall not stand. Politicians pandering for abortion are bargaining in blood, and we will not vote for them." Interestingly, this gathering to hear Mildred Jefferson speak as a black pro-life woman happened in front of the St. Louis courthouse where Dred Scott's first legal case occurred in 1847. The denial of rights to the unborn by Roe struck pro-lifers as a similar situation. The tragic story concerned the black slave Dred Scott, who entered free territory with his master and then sued for his freedom all the way to the Supreme Court in 1857 and lost. In some ways, Dred Scott and Roe were very different cases. Dred affirmed a long-standing American precedent, the existence of slavery, that was protected in the U.S. Constitution. Whereas Roe overturned a long-standing precedent, abortion viewed as a crime, in common law and state laws. Nevertheless, while Dred Scott has been widely recognized as the worst Supreme Court decision ever made, Roe was like it in 4 ways. 1, both Dred Scott and Roe tried to settle a contentious issue through the judiciary rather than through the political process. 2, both cases were supposed to end debate over slavery and abortion. Instead, they exacerbated the situation. Dred Scott increased tensions leading to the Civil War. Roe energized the rapid expansion of the pro-life movement as the largest social protest movement since the 1960s. For example, tens of thousands of pro-lifers were arrested for protesting and blocking abortion clinics from 1986 to 1992. And hundreds of thousands have joined the annual March for Life in Washington, D.C., a peaceful event that has inspired other marches for life around the world. Both Supreme Court decisions were later revoked. 3, Dred Scott denied legal status and civil rights to the enslaved, like Roe did to the unborn. And now number 4. Dred Scott defined slaves as property, like Roe did in effect to the unborn. As forms of property, slaves and the unborn supported economic interests worth billions of dollars in today's money. Slavery and abortion equaled big business. Slavery and abortion also appealed to a similar justification: privacy. Now, courts have long viewed homes and families as zones of privacy protected from government interference. And slavery was defended on that basis. For example, the failed Corwin Amendment of 1861, for example, proposed to keep the federal government away from domestic institutions. That was code for slavery. Plantations and domestic institutions were private property, so you could not protest the existence or the treatment of slaves on the plantation. Plantations were private spaces, like wombs. My plantation, my choice. To cover up what was really happening on plantations and in wombs, pro-choice defenders of slavery and pro-choice defenders of abortion posed as exemplars of traditional American values. They interpreted the founding ideas of equality, liberty, and rights in terms beneficial to themselves against the slaves and the unborn. All the while, they appeared in polite society as sophisticated and educated elites. They turned the tables and blamed abolitionists and pro-lifers as the immoral ones and as fanatics. They blamed abolitionists and pro-lifers for imposing their beliefs on others. They claimed slavery and abortion are actually good for slaves and women. And they silenced the voices of vulnerable and socially unseen human beings, dehumanizing them to protect their agendas. They also sought to curtail freedom of speech among those who criticized slavery or abortion. In the name of choice and privacy, the abortion movement, like the pro-slavery movement of the 19th century, has been able to exert much control on the federal government, many state governments, the Democratic Party, much of the judiciary and media, elite and popular culture, the business world, and the mainstream narrative of what it means to be American. Section 4, the pro-life movement. So in the face of such cultural power, what can be done? Now, T.S. Eliot wrote in the same essay quoted earlier, he said this, quote, "We fight for lost causes because we know that our defeat and dismay may be the preface to our successors' victory, though that victory itself will be temporary. We fight rather to keep something alive than in the expectation that anything will triumph." Now, by 1970, Catholic pro-life leaders realized they were losing the fight against abortion, as Alaska, Hawaii, Washington, and New York made abortion legal for any reason in early pregnancy. Resistance to abortion was dismissed as merely a Catholic thing and therefore simply a sectarian agenda. The future of expanding abortion seemed inevitable to some. In response, Catholics made two important decisions. The first was institutional. Dedicated Catholics built networks of institutions at the state level, like Women Concerned for the Unborn Child in Pennsylvania, 1969. National level, like American Life League, 1979. And the international level, like Human Life International in 1981. At the local level, someone like Catholic convert Robert Pearson started the first pregnancy help center in 1969 in Hawaii to help women make life-affirming choices. He had fought unsuccessfully against abortion legalization in Hawaii, so he and his wife took in women facing unexpected pregnancy and linked them to needed social services. Pearson moved to the U.S. mainland to help open pregnancy help centers across the country, becoming a pro-life hero. Since then, many Protestants support and run such centers too, and many have evolved into medical clinics. There are currently more than 2,500 of these centers in the United States compared to less than 800 abortion clinics. Abortion supporters attack them as delivering misinformation. Nevertheless, the state of Texas is investing $100 million into its Alternatives to Abortion program in 2022 and 2023 to promote childbirth and support services to pregnant women and their families through pregnancy help centers. Oklahoma is moving in the same direction with its Choosing Childbirth Act. Now, naturally, much of the media castigates these efforts as wastes of money. Nevertheless, pregnancy help centers play a crucial role in our American society as places for people to live out their principles in service to others, and thus strengthen the grassroots foundation of the pro-life movement. So this first decision that was made was this institutional development. Okay? The second important decision that Catholics made was intellectual. To shift the ground of the pro-life argument from natural law to liberal values, like the right to life, inherent by nature, in the classical liberal tradition of William Blackstone and the Declaration of Independence. The father of the pro-life movement, Father James McHugh, mentioned earlier, took this path. So here I want to draw heavily on the recent argument of historian Daniel K. Williams, that the pro-life movement emerged not after Roe among conservatives, as might be assumed, but before Roe among rights-conscious liberals, like Democratic Senator Edward M. Kennedy, Democratic Vice Presidential candidate Sargent Shriver, civil rights activist Jesse Jackson, Lutheran minister Richard John Newhouse, before Roe. And also Catholic liberals like Father James McHugh, who were inspired by Catholic social teaching and New Deal liberalism. They supported other rights-conscious movements among blacks and women and thought abortion should be prohibited by law but also addressed through social welfare programs. During the 1960s, Father McHugh and his liberal Catholic allies noticed two things. First, after Humanae Vitae in 1968, even many Catholics failed to follow church teaching on contraception. So if the pro-life cause was linked to contraception, it was doomed. Second, they noticed that the pro-life cause tended to win in states where Catholic laity, not bishops, led the struggle. Thus, many pro-lifers adopted an American-style civic engagement model of political action rather than a church-led model. Lay people like physician John C. Wilkie and his wife Barbara pioneered the use of graphic images to help others realize what happened in abortions, as well as writing the booklet Handbook on Abortion in 1971, which sold all over the world. Women like Mary Winter in Pennsylvania started taking leadership roles on their own at this time too, and that was a game changer. Women leaders helped shift focus from just the unborn as victims of abortion to women as victims too, inaugurating a powerful line of argumentation. Moving forward on this intellectual and strategic basis, the pro-life movement started to gain widespread appeal in 1971 and also 1972, stopping the abortion movement in its tracks with dozens of victories in state legislatures. This pro-life, state-led phase suddenly ended with Roe in 1973. Now, the problem with Roe was that it privileged one set of liberal values, choice and autonomy, over another set of liberal values, the right to life. The conflict between different sets of liberal values in the early 1970s did not play out between political parties like it does today, Republican versus Democrat. There were pro-life and pro-choice politicians in both parties back then. However, Roe changed that situation. Roe's privileging of choice over life had a profound influence on American new liberals, tipping the balance of power in the Democratic Party away from the right to life in favor of the right to choose, though there is an active Democrats for Life organization today. Despite the major setback of Roe, Daniel Williams, this historian, argued that the reason the pro-life movement has thrived, whereas so many other religiously inspired reform movements have failed, like prohibition, school prayer, man-woman marriage movements, failed. The reason the pro-life movement has not gone in that direction and has succeeded as well as it has is because, in large measure, because it's depended on its ability to ground its message in liberal values like the right to life and social welfare concerns. This has allowed it to attract a wide coalition beyond just Catholics. Even academics hostile to the pro-life movement have observed that by adopting rights language to defend the unborn, the pro-life movement skillfully adapted the ideas and tactics of progressive politics to become, ironically, one of the most successful political movements of the 20th century. For example, the National Right to Life Committee has achieved tremendous political power in Washington, D.C. through campaign financing, especially for Republicans, drafting model legislation, organizing corporate boycotts, and coining the phrase partial birth abortion. That was adopted into the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act of 2003, which was the greatest pro-life political success before Dobbs. When the partial birth abortion ban was found to be constitutional by the Supreme Court in 2007, this encouraged states during the 2010s to find more ways to limit abortion through mandatory ultrasounds and waiting periods or safety regulations. More than 50 abortion clinics closed in 2013 alone. The National Right to Life Committee played an important role in these developments. The current president, Carol Tobias, is a Lutheran from North Dakota. The NRLC is now the oldest pro-life organization and has 7 million members in every state. That contrasts with the 2.5 million members of NARAL Pro-Choice America, the oldest pro-abortion organization. So then, how did Dobbs happen? Well, after Roe, pro-life leaders adopted a new political strategy, right? Because the old state model was ended by Roe, so they needed a new strategy from 1973 onward, okay? And that new political strategy involved alliance with Republicans, since Democrats had largely embraced pro-choice ideology. The only way to reverse a Supreme Court decision like Roe was to pass an amendment to the Constitution. So, pro-lifers rallied around a human life amendment during the 1970s and early 1980s, but without success. In 1984, their political strategy shifted again to allying with the rising evangelical Christian right in electing presidents who would appoint pro-life justices and electing senators who would approve them. This was the hope for the Reagan administration. Unfortunately, the strategy narrowly failed in the 5-4 Planned Parenthood versus Casey 1992 decision that reaffirmed Roe. However, with their new conservative allies, pro-lifers kept trying. President George H.W. Bush appointed Justice Clarence Thomas, and George W. Bush appointed Samuel Alito. President Donald Trump appointed Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Barrett, making the 5-4 decision possible in Dobbs to overthrow Roe. The 40-year judicial strategy triumphed in 2022, freeing the way for numerous state-level legislations to take effect, a process underway now. So, Dobbs returned the abortion issue to the people and their elected representatives. However, the spirit of Roe still inhabits much of the country, where people passionately hold to abortion as a right. This new states' rights phase is volatile. The state of California will give money to abort the unborn, while the state of Georgia will give a tax credit to keep the unborn. A completely new playing field is opened for the pro-life movement. Where will this states' rights phase lead? Well, to see the current situation in perspective, think back to the political dissension over that other highly contentious moral issue in American history, slavery. You see, views on slave ownership moved from toleration in the 1780s to celebration in the 1850s. It's hard to imagine this. Slavery being celebrated, but it was by the 1850s. Enslaving others came to be seen as a right, thus fully American, and even a positive good for American society, needing to be extended as far as possible, including into new states and new territories of the West. Similarly, views on abortion have moved from toleration to celebration, from unfortunately necessary to a positive good to be extended as far as possible. So in the 1850s, this clash of rights between slave owners and abolitionists played out in battles to control the Senate, which was split evenly. Some things never change. To try to diffuse this tense situation, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 created new territories and opened them up to popular vote on the question of slavery. This is what the Dobbs decision has just done with abortion. Let the people decide. Unfortunately, back then, this solution inaugurated a period of violence when pro-slavery and anti-slavery activists streamed into Kansas, trying to influence elections there. At one point, there were two legislatures in Kansas, a pro-slavery one and an anti-slavery one, each with its own state constitution proposal. Eventually, anti-slavery forces won in Kansas, but nationally, opinions hardened into that tragic map we all know so well from our history textbooks dividing slave states from free states. Now, we will have not slave states and free states, but abortion states and life states. Now, this compromise situation may be tolerable for a long time. It could also lead to the crisis of a house divided. This is when extreme moral conflict becomes unbearable without some national solution. This may happen because many today will sense that there is something incomplete about leaving an important moral question like abortion simply up to the states. Abraham Lincoln felt that tension and incompleteness about slavery. This is why he was actually opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act giving over slavery to popular vote, or to the principle of self-government, as he called it. Which is actually surprising, because Abraham Lincoln is known for the famous words, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people." Nevertheless, this principle of self-government, he said in his 1854 Peoria address, had no just application to the question of slavery. Interesting. He said this, quote, "Or perhaps I should say that whether self-government has such just application depends upon whether a Negro is not or is a man. If he is not a man, why in that case he who is a man may as a matter of self-government do just as he pleases with him. But if the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one's making a slave of another," unquote. Lincoln's clear-eyed look at the truth of the black person's humanity grounded his moral courage. The pro-life movement's clear-eyed look at the truth of the unborn's humanity grounds its moral courage. This is not to deny that abortion, any less than slavery, also represents a political and an economic conflict of interest, too. Where will this situation lead today? We cannot know. But in 1858, just after joining the Republican Party, Lincoln said this in his House Divided speech, quote, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it, or its advocates will push it forward till it become the lawful in all the states, old as well as new, the North as well as the South." Abortion seems to have the same kind of moral resonance today as slavery did in the 1850s. So in conclusion, when a protest movement triumphs, it must pivot from opposition to governance. R.R. Reno wrote those words in First Things magazine recently. So in places where it can, the pro-life movement must now push for major shifts in law and culture to dismantle the system that perpetuates abortion. We need a new age of reconstruction, like after the Civil War, to undo the institutions of slavery in the South. In this first Reconstruction, thousands of Northerners headed south to serve as missionaries, teachers, and administrators to help transform the states of the former Confederacy. They ultimately failed to achieve political equality for blacks, and backlash entrenched racism more deeply in American society for generations. However, Reconstruction succeeded in establishing independent black families, churches, and schools, and a framework of legal rights enshrined in constitutional amendments. From these, the Civil Rights Revolution eventually emerged, and American culture shifted. Thus, as historian Eric Foner wrote, Reconstruction was not only a specific period after the Civil War, but it was also the beginning of an extended historical process, the adjustment of American society to the end of slavery. This is what must happen again today, pro-life Reconstruction. This will be a drawn-out adjustment of American society to the end of legal abortion. This period will be full of political conflict and backlash advances that will appear as pro-choice victories for a time. In the meantime, at the state and national levels, pro-life leaders must clarify and extend laws to protect both the unborn and women from abortion. One post-Roe model abortion law by the Bopp law firm suggests enforcement through licensing penalties, civil remedies, and criminal enforcement by state officials. Pro-life leaders need to work for conscience protection for medical and pharmacy workers and for pro-family economic policies aimed at helping mothers and communities choose life over abortion. Now, besides recourse to both the liberal and conservative values that we've talked about in this talk, that have shaped the pro-life history that we've seen, pro-life reconstruction will take great prudence. Laws do not perfect human beings. The National Prohibition Act of 1919 did not end alcoholism. Laws should not try zealously to regulate all morality and can only accomplish so much. In addition, the political leader must operate in the arena of risk, allies, and political compromise. Abraham Lincoln understood that. He was not a slavery abolitionist. In fact, many abolitionists viewed him with disdain as someone who had compromised his anti-slavery principles to get elected. However, Lincoln patiently remained true to his principles and eventually became the great emancipator. The pro-life movement needs patience and incrementalism today. On the cultural front, the pro-life movement needs moral imagination. That was how the abolitionist movement started, with slave narratives that helped millions of white people imagine the awful reality of slavery. Frederick Douglass, for example, escaped from slavery and then wrote a letter to his old master in 1848, quote, "What you are, I am. You are a man, and so am I. God created both and made us separate beings." Like Douglass, abortion survivor Melissa Ohden helps others today view abortion from the victim's point of view. The unborn child is a little man or a little woman, a separate, if dependent, being. Surviving a saline abortion in 1977, Ohden testified in 2021 before a Senate Judiciary Committee, "Life is the foundation of all other rights." Just as the abolitionist movement helped Americans reimagine the meaning of rights to include the right not to be a slave, and how repugnant the older view was of the right to enslave others, so the pro-life reconstruction will help Americans reimagine a new meaning of rights to include the right to life of the unborn, and how repugnant the older view was of the right to abort. Just as in the 19th century, this reimagining will change our understanding of American founding ideals and what it means to be American. Now, working to influence the moral imagination of our time will lead to conversion of heart. That was also how the abolitionist movement started, with personal religious conversion like that of the British politician William Wilberforce in the 1780s. He and his ecumenical Christian allies built the first mass human rights movement in the English-speaking world. Their success inspired American abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, who founded the Anti-Slavery Society in 1833 that soon attracted 250,000 members. One biographer said this: "The source of Garrison's power was the Bible. From his earliest days, he read the Bible constantly and prayed constantly. It was with this fire that he started his conflagration." Now, a conflagration is an unstoppable wildfire, blazing a path of destruction through whole forests. A terrible thing. The end of a world and a cleansing away of all that is old and dry to give way to the new. Jesus said to his disciples, "I have come to set fire on earth, and how I wish it were already blazing." The plantation owners experienced Garrison's anti-slavery conflagration as the end of their world, full of bitterness and resentment at the loss of their way of life. Pro-choice advocates will also experience an end of their world as the spiritual conflagration within the pro-life movement continues to spread and give birth to a new culture. The abolitionist and pro-life movements showed how spiritual obedience within the vocations of humble individuals in history can change whole cultures. Spirit and vocation are the hidden forces at work beneath the surface of history. After personally performing 5,000 abortions, ex-abortionist Bernard Nathanson attended a protest by Operation Rescue against Planned Parenthood in New York City in 1989. Around 1,200 demonstrators prayed and sang and reminded each other of their absolute commitment against any violence. Nathanson watched them and wondered how they could sacrifice so much for the unborn who they could not even see. "I was shaken by the intensity of the spirituality of these demonstrations," he wrote. There were Catholics and Protestants together, and they were so deeply rooted in spiritual conviction that even the police hung back in deference, I believe, to the purity of their action. He watched these smiling people surrounded by angry pro-choicers, hostile media, courts fining and jailing them, and city leaders threatening them. I began seriously to question what indescribable force generated them to this activity. And for the first time in my entire adult life, he wrote, I began to entertain seriously the notion of God. The biggest mistake the pro-abortion side makes, Nathanson wrote, is failing to understand the depth of commitment to the cause. Pro-life convictions spring from and have their roots in traditional Judeo-Christian values, in the Bible, and in the commanding concept of the immortal soul. For abortion supporters to underestimate the virtually irresistible force of the pro-life conviction is a fatal mistake. Thank you. Great, so we just have time for one or two questions, I think. Yeah.
Really great talk. Do you foresee? Thank you. Great talk. A lot of history, a lot of detail. Did I understand correctly that you see a hardening of positions, states such as we are, at least it looks that way, for life, and those other states that, as you see emerging already, like California, being centers of destruction of life. Do you think that's going to continue and there will be a significant effect from that in our life?
Yeah, I absolutely think it'll continue, and it'll result in deadlock in D.C. For quite a while until the pro-life movement can figure out how to sort of repackage its message and kind of restart in this new kind of environment, and then they will push forward and they will win because as as you become more shrill about slavery, it becomes more distasteful. Right? Because people start seeing, what the reality actually is. Same thing with abortion. As people become more shrill about it, more, defensive of it in public, then the reality of it will become more obvious to more people, and that will undermine the pro-choice side, I think. But we're talking long term, right? I mean, it's going to be 100 years. None of us are going to see this full pro-life reconstruction. This is what T.S. Eliot said. We work now to set up the future for another victory, but this is decades of work.
So you've mentioned a lot how the pro-life movement in America especially was led by Catholics a lot of the time, and that they were often dismissed because, it's just a Catholic movement and, that doesn't apply to us. And so with the recent decision, I've noticed a lot of discussion about contraception, gay marriage, that whole circle of family-related issues. Mm-hmm. And since really the major force against contraception would be the Catholic Church, how do you see these issues proceeding? Do you think they'll continue to be dismissed as, it's just a Catholic thing, like the pro-life movement was? Or do you think they might continue to grow and become more understood and more argued for by other groups besides Catholics? Yeah,
so I don't think there's any political future for movement on those topics because there's no movement, right, for them, like there is a pro-life movement. So, but that doesn't mean that, nothing can happen. I mean, because, at the level of culture, the level of parishes and conversion in a culture, you can definitely see change. But yeah, I don't think there's too much of a political future on a lot of those issues. But I definitely firmly believe that there is not just a political future for the pro-life movement, but a winnable political future. Yeah.
It seems like a lot. Oh, sorry. I'm loud. I'm a teacher. Thank you. It seems like a lot of young pro-life Americans already view these issues in terms of rights, and not only, for example, in terms of obedience to a religious authority. And so that process of reimagining the message in terms of American values like rights already seems to be underway, and yet, of course, it hasn't been very successful on the other side of the question. So what do you think are the obstacles currently preventing people who care about individual rights from seeing the right to life of the unborn as one of those rights that they should care about?
Yeah. I think the major obstacle is a problem of imagination. I think that we haven't yet had our Harriet Beecher Stowe or our Frederick Douglass. Those who changed the moral atmosphere around slavery in the 1850s. We haven't had that yet, and no figure like that has emerged in the pro-life movement yet, and we're just waiting.
And do you see abortion survivors as the ones who such a change could be built around?
Certainly possible.
Okay.
Certainly possible, because that would be the closest analogy, right, to somebody like Douglas. But people who are trying to create great films and novels and just, I mean, the whole sphere of culture in which helps the public reimagine what the dignity of life looks like and the beauty that can come through the sacrifices needed to raise our children and raise our families. Where is the moral imagination in our culture that's helping us do that? And until we figure that out, until that happens, that there can't really be a major move forward, it seems to me. Yeah. We're out of time. So we'll move outside. I'll be outside here if anybody wants to talk further. But I think there's probably a class moving in here next. Thank you very much.